Melania Trump mocked Jasmine Crockett's father for being a sanitation worker, but Jasmine answered with proof, with history, and with fire that the whole nation could not ignore. The chamber erupted, the cameras froze, and Melania was left in stunned silence. What truth turned her insult into the most humiliating collapse of her career? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Chamber of Congress blazed under blinding lights, every face caught in high definition as cameras slid from one lawmaker to another. Millions were watching live, the silence so heavy it felt like the pause before an explosion. The gavel cracked down once sharp as thunder. The hearing will now begin, the chair announced, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Melania Trump didn't wait a second. She leaned forward, eyes glinting with contempt, her voice slicing the silence. Your father was nothing but a sanitation worker pushing a filthy cart. The history of America will never remember those who dirty their hands with garbage. Her words detonated across the hall like shrapnel, leaving a stunned hush in their wake. Gasps erupted. Some lawmakers pressed their lips tight. Others shook their heads in disbelief, the air quivering with tension. Reporters snapped photos in a frenzy. The camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett, her eyes blazing, her grip, crushing the folder in her hands. The atmosphere tightened like a noose. Everyone knew this was not politics as usual, but a fight over dignity, memory, and the soul of justice. The chamber held its breath, the silence stretched tight after the gavel strike. Whispers from the previous shock still lingered, but Melania wasn't finished. She leaned forward again, her voice dripping with disdain, eyes locked on Jasmine. Your father, the sanitation worker, swept the streets and then disappeared. He was nothing more than it. The words fell like poison, echoing through microphones and into millions of homes watching live. Every syllable cut like glass, sharp and deliberate, designed to humiliate. The room froze. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a word. The weight of Melania's sentence hung in the air, pressing down on every chest like stone. America heard it raw and unfiltered. The camera zoomed in on the stunned faces of senators, aides, reporters, all caught between shock and disbelief. It was the kind of silence that comes right before the eruption, the kind that makes every second unbearable. Then slowly, Jasmine pushed back her chair. She rose deliberate, her posture tall and unshaken. Her eyes blazed with a fire that no insult could quench, her jaw set firm. She stepped forward to the microphone, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. You are wrong, she declared, her tone vibrating with conviction. He kept hospitals clean, schools, safe, cities, healthy. The very people you sneer at protected the lives of millions of Americans. Her words carried not only defiance, but an unshakable truth. Each line drawing the room tighter into her orbit. Reporters jolted to life, pens flying, cameras flashing, capturing every syllable, every flicker of resolve on her face. The audience leaned forward, pulled into the gravity of the moment. The tension twisted tighter, turning the hearing into a battleground of history and dignity. Melania's smirk wavered for the first time, her eyes narrowing. But Jasmine pressed on, unrelenting. Then Jasmine reached down and lifted a thick folder from the desk. Her fingers gripped the worn edges, the weight of decades held inside. She raised it high, the pages trembling under the harsh light. The words were steady, heavy with meaning. This, she announced, as a copy of the letter Martin Luther King, Jr. sent to the sanitation workers of Memphis in 1968. The chamber erupted with a low gasp, the recognition immediate. The name itself carried a thunder that shook the room. Jasmine opened the document, her voice rising with power as she read aloud. Even if you sweep the floors, collect the trash, or build the roads, you are sustaining the nation. Her voice rang out bold and unwavering, each word hitting like a hammer on iron. It wasn't just a line. It was history itself pulled from the past and flung into the present. The sentence soared through the air, crashing into every corner of the chamber, rattling even the most stoic faces. The impact was visceral. Senators lowered their heads, some closed their eyes, carried back to 1968. That year was carved into American memory, the year King was killed in Memphis after standing shoulder to shoulder with sanitation workers. His blood had sealed the truth Jasmine now wielded like a weapon. The weight of it pressed down on the hall, dragging everyone into the gravity of her words. The sound of her reading was more than testimony. It was resurrection. Jasmine's voice sharpened each word now a strike, her hand gripping the letter with unshakable strength. My father was not invisible, she thundered. He stood with the very men Martin Luther King Jr. called the heartbeat of social justice. Her tone rose higher, carrying fury and pride in equal measure, demanding the nation hear what Melania wanted erased. The words cracked through the chamber like lightning, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. Gasps gave way to a rumble of voices. Reporters nearly falling over each other to capture the moment. The senators shifted in their seats, their faces carved in stone, some visibly shaken. The audience in the gallery erupted in muffled applause before the gavel slammed down in a desperate attempt to restore order. The energy was uncontrollable. The chamber alive with history colliding against arrogance. Melania sat back, her lips curling in a forced smirk, eyes darting to the cameras as if to remind herself she was still on stage. She tilted her chin, feigning calm, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, a rhythm meant to look casual, but carrying the beat of discomfort. The camera caught her profile, the practiced composure fighting to hold as the chamber roared with Jasmine's words still echoing. The gavel slammed again, louder this time, its crack slicing through the storm of voices. Order. The chair barked, but the command barely pierced the air. The echoes of Jasmine's defiance still clung to the chamber walls, pulsing in every corner like aftershocks from an earthquake. Senators exchanged uneasy glances. The audience leaned forward, the whole room vibrating with tension that refused to settle. The authority of the gavel could not erase the words already spoken. And they lingered heavy and unshakable. Melania straightened in her chair, her smirk tightening into something sharper, colder. She narrowed her eyes, her tone rising with forced steel. King may have said those words, but your father was still just a street sweeper, anonymous, forgotten. No one has ever built a statue for him. The insult landed with deliberate cruelty, slicing into the fragile, quiet. Her voice carried over the microphones, each word dripping with dismissal, intended to remind everyone of hierarchy of status, of who was remembered and who was erased. The silence that followed was suffocating. The chamber sank under the weight of her sentence, as if every breath had been stolen from the air. No shuffling, no coughing, not even the scratch of a pen. The remark spread across the room like smoke, clinging to every person listening, forcing them to sit with its venom. For a moment, it felt like the hearing itself had stopped, suspended between rage and restraint. The pause stretched long, unbearable, like the hush before a thunder splits the sky. Jasmine lowered herself slowly into her chair. Every movement deliberate, calculated. She didn't fire back right away. Her hands intertwined tightly on the desk knuckles, widening as she pressed them together, holding back the surge rising in her chest. Her eyes locked forward, burning with a restrained fury that said more than words could. She looked less like someone defeated and more like a predator crouched low, waiting for the exact moment to strike. The energy around her was magnetic, dangerous, pulling every gaze toward her stillness. The cameras caught it all. They zoomed close on her clenched fingers, on the fire flickering in her eyes, on the subtle tremor in her breath. Networks broadcast the image live to millions. The shot framed like the prelude to a cinematic showdown. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned forward, unconsciously caught. Even those who hated politics couldn't look away. They could feel it. Something was coiling tighter, ready to spring. Inside the chamber, faces told the story. Some senators frowned deeply, sensing the storm that Melania's words had just provoked. Others looked anxious, their eyes darting from Melania to Jasmine, as if tracking the fuse of a bomb. Reporters held their cameras, steady lenses, locked on Jasmine's face, waiting for the explosion that everyone knew was coming. The gallery sat frozen hands, gripping railings, no one daring to breathe too loudly. The room had transformed into a pressure cooker, and the silence was the hiss before the whistle. The silence from the last exchange had barely settled when Melania leaned forward again, her lips curling with disdain. She let out a cold laugh that sliced through the air, her words dropped like knives, calculated and cruel. Sanitation workers leave only stench, not legacy. America does not build statues for the sentence hit the chamber like a hammer swung low. Cruel and final. It was meant to end the fight, to slam the door on dignity. The reaction was instant. A loud rumble of voices surged across the hall. Shame, one senator barked, and then another joined the sound, swelling into a chorus of outrage. Chairs shifted, fists pounded desks, and the chamber boiled with noise. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashing like lightning as they scrambled to capture the eruption. The chair slammed the gavel, but the gavel sounded small, like a pebble tossed into a hurricane. The chamber was no longer still. It was chaos, pure and raw. Then Jasmine moved. She pushed her chair back so abruptly that its legs screeched across the polished floor. She rose with force, a single motion that drew every eye. She thrust one hand high, palm open, cutting through the uproar. The chamber stumbled into silence, every head swiveling back to her. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, lenses locked on the figure standing tall in the center of the storm. Her other hand pointed to the technicians. Her voice rang like an order no one dared disobey. Put it on the screen now. The giant display behind her flickered static for a heartbeat, then bloomed into black and white grain. And suddenly, history stood in the chamber. The photo filled the wall. Sanitation workers in Memphis, 1968. Rows of men holding signs to their chest with words as stark as stone. I am a man. For words, block letters carried like shields against a world that refused to see them. Their eyes were locked, their jaws set, and even through the decades, their defiance roared louder than any gavel. The chamber gasped as one, a collective intake of air that seemed to rattle the windows. Reporters explode. The click of shutters turned into a storm. Flash bulbs firing so fast the chamber strobed with white light. Photographers leaned dangerously forward over the rails, desperate to capture the towering image blazing above Jasmine. Senators blinked against the brightness, their faces caught in sharp snapshots of shock, recognition, and shame. The gallery pressed forward, knuckles tight on the railing, their mouths open, words frozen. Jasmine spun back to the mic, her voice rising like thunder, her eyes blazing in the glow of the screen. She didn't just speak, she roared, when you mock my father, you mock Martin Luther King Jr., you mock the entire civil rights movement of America. The words detonated across the chamber. Every syllable carried heat ripping through the air, bouncing off marble walls and landing heavy on every heart. The room convulsed, desks shook under fists, the pounding echoing like drums. Senators shot to their feet, their voices overlapping, and some shouted justice. Others simply roared, their faces red with fury. The gallery erupted, the sound swelling into a chorus of outrage and triumph. The chair's gavel slammed again and again. The sharp cracks, a desperate attempt to leash a storm that refused to be caged. The noise climbed higher, rolling through the hall like thunder. Staffers darted between seats. Their calls for calm, swallowed by the roar. Papers flew, cameras swung, and the chamber felt like it was shaking apart under the weight of the moment. History wasn't just remembered. It was alive, burning, undeniable. The screen behind Jasmine glared down the words, I am a man, shining brighter than the chandeliers. And in the center of it all, Jasmine stood unyielding, her body silhouetted against the wall of history. She looked small compared to the image towering behind her. But somehow she felt larger, as if every heartbeat in the room had shifted to her chest. Her cry still echoed, vibrating in the bones of everyone present. She didn't waver. She didn't blink. She stared down Melania with a fury that stripped the smirk off her opponent's face. Melania faltered. The camera caught it. The brief flicker of panic, the twitch of her lips, the dart of her eyes. Her skin drained pale beneath the heavy powder. Her mask of arrogance cracking at the edges. She tried to reset her posture, tried to lift her chin, but her gaze betrayed her. Sliding away from Jasmine, away from the screen. She clutched her notes with trembling fingers, her knuckles white as if the paper itself could anchor her in a storm she had unleashed. The chamber didn't let her hide. The chants, the pounding, the flashing lights, all of it pinned her in place. The image on the screen towered above her, unrelenting, eternal, while Jasmine's words still rang in. For once, Melania Trump looked cornered, stripped of control, drowning under the weight of history. She thought she could sneer away. The roar from the chamber had barely faded when the chair slammed the gavel again. "Order," he barked, his voice ricocheting off marble walls, but the command felt small against the lingering storm. The walls still vibrated with the aftershock of Jasmine's words. The gallery buzzing with restrained voices, the press corps leaning forward, hungry for more. The gavel cracked a second time louder, but the room still shook as if the echoes themselves refused to obey. Melania seized the moment, forcing her voice through the noise like a blade. She leaned toward the microphone, her face tightening into a mask of fury. "Comparing your father to King is nothing but cheap political theater." She snapped, every word dipped in venom. Her tone was harsh. Her delivery clipped, crafted for headlines, but steep. The words landed heavy in attempt to claw back control, to paint Jasmine's fire as nothing more than spectacle. For a beat, the chamber stilled again, the insult burning in the silence it left behind. Eyes turned to Jasmine, waiting, bracing. Everyone knew she had not yet played her final card. The tension hung thick like the charged air before a storm cracks open the sky. Senators shifted in their seats. Staffers clutched their notepads and the cameras closed in, framing Jasmine's every breath. The gallery leaned forward, almost trembling as though they could sense something massive hovering just out of sight. The entire chamber was suspended, caught in the gravity of anticipation. Jasmine did not rise. Instead, she lowered herself back into her chair with deliberate calm. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, cool and razor-sharp. Her eyes, though, it wasn't surrender. It was promise. A silent warning that the storm was not over. She sat there, hands folded, gaze locked, every line of her body, telegraphing the same truth. The final thunder was coming. And when it struck, nothing in that chamber would stand untouched. The last roar was still fading when the moment shifted like a camera cut and the room's focus snapped back to the table. Melania leaned back in her chair, letting the posture sell her contempt. Then rolled forward into the microphone with a slow, practiced breath. Her eyes narrowed, the corners of her mouth dipped into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Your father only swept streets. A man like him could die, and this country wouldn't remember him for a single day." The words were clean and cruel, designed to travel well on television. They floated for a beat, then sank like a stone into the center of the chamber. It wasn't calm. It was pressure thick, suffocating, the kind that makes a room feel smaller than it is. Senators froze. Mid-breath staffers stalled with pens half poised. And the gallery stiffened as if the benches had turned to ice. Even the cameras seemed to steady themselves. Red light steady as heartbeats. The insult hung there naked and heavy, daring someone to move first. Every ear strained toward the same point: Jasmine. Jasmine rose slowly as if refusing to let the moment rush her. The scrape of her chair legs was a clean line through the quiet. She didn't reach for the mic yet. She reached for a weathered leather notebook. Its spine cracked, its edges, softened by years. She opened it carefully, like unfolding a flag, and slid out a single sheet of thick paper stamped with a red seal faded to dusky brown. The paper caught the light, and a shallow ripple of anticipation moved across the benches. It looked official because it was. She lifted it high, letting every lens lock on before she spoke. Her voice was firm, measured, carrying the gravity of the words instead of straining for it. This is Resolution Number Miru 214 adopted on June 17, 1990 by the Dallas City Council. This resolution honors a group of sanitation workers for extraordinary contributions to protecting the community after the 1989 floods. In that list appears the name John Crockett. The syllables landed like seals being pressed to vellum, formal, final, impossible to shrug off. The chamber seemed to exhale in one long shaken breath. Murmurs exploded, not noisy but pervasive, a rush of sound that filled every corner. Cameras punched in tight, hunting specific proof the line that read John Crockett, crisp as the day it was typed. The red city seal bloomed on the giant screen overhead, its ring and starline sharp despite the years. Photographers leaned so far over the rail that a sergeant-at-arms lifted a warning hand and then dropped it, transfixed by the text himself. On the senators' desks, papers lay forgotten. On the gallery rail, fingers tightened until knuckles pad. The evidence didn't argue, it announced. Jasmine lowered her eyes, then read again, and her voice gathered strength like a storm over open water. In the hours when the city lay in ruin, this team of workers labored for 72 hours without rest to restore the streets, safeguard public health, and prevent outbreaks of disease. The Dallas City Council recognizes them as the keepers of the city's pulse. The phrasing rang like a bell, clean and resonant, cutting through the air without a shred of theatrics. Then impact. A senator shot to his feet, palms hammering the desk with a sharp report, and another followed, echo to echo. Read it again. Microphones trembled on their flexible stalks as the air itself shook with applause and shock. The chair's gavel pounded, but it only framed the noise like drum beats under thunder. Across the screen, the seal glowed like a verdict, and the typed letters John Crockett burned brighter than any headline. Jasmine lifted her eyes from the page and let the room fall quiet enough to hear the hum of the lights. The paper didn't waver in her hand. Neither did her stare. My father has been recognized by this city. History has written his name. No one, including you, can erase that. The lines were not shouted. They did not need to be. They carried the weight of the document, the flood, the hours worked, and the stink of ruin, the children who came back to clean streets because men like John Crockett refused to sleep. The truth stood there with her, steady and unblinking. Melania did blink once. The color drained from her face until the makeup looked like armor she couldn't lift. Her gaze slid off the screen, off the seal, off the name, wandering like a lost signal, searching for a tower. She clutched her notes hard enough to buckle the paper. And when she tried to set her chin, the muscles underneath betrayed her and shook. No rebuttal came, only the noise of a room that had already decided which side of the line it stood on. Applause rolled in like surf on stone, loud, layered, relentless. Light swung and steadied, finding the document on the screen and holding it there like a sentence pronounced. The text glowed over the chamber as if etched into the air itself, as if it might still be there when the bulbs cooled and the room went dark. For the first time all morning, the story didn't belong to taunts or titles. It belonged to a piece of paper, a city's memory, and a man whose work did not vanish when the sun came up. And in that glow, the arrogance that had filled the room a moment earlier looked suddenly small. The chamber fell into a suffocating stillness. The kind of silence that feels like it has weight. The crowd, the senators, the press, they were all frozen, holding their breath, waiting. Everyone in the room sensed it. Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver the final strike. The tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt louder, as if the building itself knew a verdict was about to be spoken. Jasmine stepped forward, the sound of her heels echoing across the chamber floor. She leaned into the microphone, her back straight, her voice slicing the silence with steel. My father swept the streets, but he left his name in the history of the fight for social justice. He doesn't need a statue because he laid the foundation of justice itself. Her words cracked like hammer. The statement wasn't just testimony. It was a sentence, a reckoning. For a heartbeat, the chamber shook with the impact of truth. Then the explosion came. The reaction was instant, volcanic. Senators erupted their palms, slamming the desk so hard the wood rattled. The gallery rose to its feet, applause pounding the walls, rolling over the gavel like thunder drowning a drum beat. Reporters shouted into their microphones, their voices breaking in the chaos. Photographers fired their cameras in a frenzy, the constant strobe of flash bulbs painting the room in bursts of light. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, unflinching, commanding the storm as if it had always been hers to wield. But she wasn't done. She turned her eyes, locking on to Melania with a blaze that cut through the clamor. Her voice rose again, colder, now sharper, fueled by both fury and control. "And you, Melania Trump, what did you ever give to this country? Nothing. No sacrifice. All you have ever given is disdain. Disdain for the workers who clean your streets. Disdain for the very people who keep America alive." The line hit the chamber like a strike of lightning. Gasps surged audible and raw. A senator barked. "That's right." While others nodded hard, their faces taut with approval. The audience roared, their cheers overlapping into one furious wave. The weight of Jasmine's words pinned Melania in place, exposed her arrogance under the lights. It was not just accusation. It was exposure, turning the cameras back on her to reveal emptiness where pride once stood. The cameras moved in cinematic rhythm. In slow motion, they caught Melania's shoulders sinking, her gaze darting downward, her face collapsing into something pale and fragile. The woman who had sneered minutes ago now looked small, cornered, diminished. The lens cut to Jasmine standing straight, light washing over her. Every line of her body defiant. Behind her, the giant screen still glowed with her father's name, the official resolution blazing like scripture. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a symbol, a warrior, defending the dignity of labor and the legacy of civil rights. The chamber detonated again, this time with even greater force. The entire hall rose as one, a standing ovation that shook the marble floor beneath their feet. Applause cracked like thunderclaps, rolling in waves that refused to fade. Reporters screamed to be heard above the roar, their microphones rattling in their hands. Camera flashes lit the chamber like lightning in a storm. Each one capturing the same indelible image. Jasmine triumphant, Melania broken. The gavel pounded uselessly, lost in the uproar of history, rewriting itself in real time. The energy was chaos, but it was unified. A single voice. It wasn't just support for Jasmine. It was rejection of Melania's contempt. Rejection of the idea that dignity could ever be mocked out of existence. The sound was not only approval. It was justice itself echoing through the chamber. In the end, the image told a story better than words. Jasmine stood tall, framed by light, her father's name glowing behind her, her expression unbroken. She was the embodiment of victory and justice, the voice of every worker who had ever been dismissed as invisible. And across from her, Melania shrank into her chair. Her face shadowed her posture, caved, her presence fading. The final tableau was cinematic, unforgettable. Jasmine Crockett in the light, proud, fierce, victorious. Melania Trump in the shadows, diminished, silent, defeated. The meaning was clear. This was not just Jasmine's victory. It was the triumph of every laborer who had ever been scorned, every worker whose dignity had been dismissed, every name erased, and now restored in the beating heart of America's Congress. The roar inside the chamber had barely settled when the world outside caught fire. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett holding the resolution, her father's name blazing under the city seal, flooded across every platform. The footage looped endlessly, Jasmine raising the paper high, her voice cutting through the silence, the crowd exploding, as she declared, "History has written his name." On Twitter, the video spread like a storm front. On Facebook, it raced through timelines with captions screaming, "Justice in Congress." On TikTok, users replayed the moment in slow motion, layering it with music, some with gospel choirs, some with drums of war. By the end of the day, the clip had been viewed over 30 million times, and the count only climbed. Cable news anchors leaned into the story like oxygen. CNN ran the headline, "Crockett versus Trump, a father's legacy in Congress." MSNBC called it the moment that shook Washington. Even Fox News, scrambling for spin, could not ignore the sheer force of the footage. On their chai, the words flickered, "Melania silent as Crockett strikes." The confrontation wasn't just news. It was spectacle replayed in airports, diners, and living rooms, each showing Jasmine's defiance and Melania's collapse side by side. In homes across America, the reaction was visceral. Elderly viewers sat transfixed before their televisions, their eyes welling with tears. For them, the moment was not just a clash in Congress. It was a ghost of 1968 rising back into the present. They remembered the sanitation workers of Memphis, men standing with signs that read, "I am a man." They remembered the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., his final stand before an assassin's bullet. And now, watching Jasmine Crockett, they felt that history. "I never thought I'd live to see this," whispered a man in Ohio, his voice breaking as his granddaughter filmed him for TikTok. Across the country, gay-haired women wiped their eyes, murmuring King's words like prayer. "All labor has dignity." The past wasn't past. It was alive, pressing against the screen. Meanwhile, the very people Jasmine had spoken for, the sanitation workers, rose to answer her. In New York, a group of uniformed men gathered at their depot, crowding around a phone to replay the clip. One worker, his gloves still dusted with grit, said, "She spoke for us. That's our story." In Chicago, a union posted a statement. Jasmine Crockett reminded America that we are not invisible. We are the keepers of every city's heartbeat. Across southern states, videos poured in from sanitation crews holding brooms and trash bins, standing in solidarity. In one, a worker from Houston looked straight into the camera and said, "Thank you, Jasmine. You spoke the truth no one else dared to say." The comments section swelled with applause emojis, American flags, and the words, "Respect for the workers." The groundswell didn't stop with workers. On college campuses, students carry the torch. At Howard University, dozens marched through the quad, holding signs resurrected from history itself. "I am a man." The phrase, once born by sanitation workers in Memphis, now blazed again in 2025, carried by a new generation. Social media lit up with images of students chanting Jasmine's name, their voices echoing against the stone walls. At the University of California, students organized a candlelight vigil, projecting the clip of Jasmine's speech onto a campus building while the crowd repeated her words in unison. "He doesn't need a statue because he laid the foundation of justice itself." The sight of young faces raising old banners rattled the nation. One anchor intoned, "This is not just about a single hearing. It's a movement resurrected." Another declared, "Jasmine Crockett has connected generations, the laborers of the past, and the dreamers of today." The White House press room buzzed with questions. Reporters asked the press secretary whether the administration would issue a statement. For the first time in months, a question about sanitation workers dominated the briefing. Advocacy groups seized the spotlight, pushing for new funding, better protections, and stronger recognition for public workers. What had begun as a personal defense was turning into a political storm impossible to contain. And yet the image that stayed, burned into America's mind, was not policy, but the personal Jasmine standing tall, the paper raised high, her voice steady while Melania sat pale and broken in silence. Memes spread relentlessly. Side-by-side shots of Jasmine in light and Melania in shadow captioned "Dignity There." Some showed Jasmine's words branded in bold, "History has written his name." Others mocked Melania's silence with captions like "Nothing left to say." The internet turned the moment into folklore in real time. In living rooms, on buses and classrooms, the story was retold. Families gathered to replay the clip. Children asking who was Martin Luther King Jr. Grandparents answered with trembling voices explaining the marches, the sacrifices, the dream. Teachers assigned the video as homework, pairing it with King's speeches. What was meant as an insult in a hearing had become a national lesson, binding past and present. Even international headlines took notice. The BBC aired the clip under the title, An Echo of 1968 in Washington. In France, Lemon called it a daughter's defense, a nation's reckoning. Across Africa, commentators praised Jasmine for reviving the spirit of King. The story transcended American politics. It became a global testament to the dignity of labor. Back in the United States, the marches grew. In Memphis, sanitation workers gathered at the National Civil Rights Museum, standing beneath the balcony where King had been shot. They held up signs, "We are still men. We are still here." In Dallas, hundreds rallied outside City Hall, chanting Jasmine's name. The resolution with John Crockett's name was printed on banners, the red seal enlarged for all to see. It was as though the city itself had risen to defend one of its own. The media frenzy continued, each outlet fighting for angles, but the core never shifted. Jasmine Crockett had turned a sneer into a legacy. She had used one insult to resurrect a buried chapter of American history. And in doing so, she had struck not just at Melania, but at every notion that dignity could be erased. The chamber moment was no longer contained to marble walls. It was in the air, in the streets, on screens, on lips. America was no longer just watching. It was remembering. It was moving. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine, her father's name held high. Her voice echoing through the roar of a country awakened once again. The explosion of applause, the viral spread, the marches on campuses. These were only the beginning. The deeper impact unfolded in the days that followed as America began to wrestle with what the moment meant. Analysts filled screens, commentators sparred in studios, and columnists raced to their keyboards. Everywhere, the same question echoed. Was this just a hearing, or was this something bigger? The answer soon. This was not simply politics. This was the resurrection of a spirit many thought had been buried with Martin Luther King Jr. It was the civil rights movement speaking again, this time through the voice of Jasmine Crockett, tethered to the legacy of sanitation workers once dismissed as invisible. Night after night, panels debated it. CNN rolled endless montages. The clip of Jasmine lifting the resolution, the chamber erupting, Melania shrinking into silence. MSNBC ran a special titled From Memphis to Washington, The Dignity of Labor. Even conservative outlets, though hostile, acknowledged the gravity. One Fox analyst grumbled, "Like it or not, she has tapped into something raw and real." Social media boiled over, not with fleeting memes alone, but with long threads connecting Jasmine's words to decades of struggle. The marches, the strikes, the endless grind of workers who had never been given the spotlight. It was not long before the moment crossed into classrooms. Across the country, teachers printed out transcripts of Jasmine's speech. In history lessons, students compared her words to King's address in Memphis 1968 when he told sanitation workers, "All labor has dignity." High schoolers in Detroit stood in front of their peers reading Jasmine's lines aloud. "He doesn't need a statue because he laid the foundation of justice itself." In Atlanta, a middle school teacher projected the viral clip on a smartboard, letting the silence of the chamber and the roar of applause teach the lesson better than any textbook could. Universities, too, seizes the moment. At Howard, professors wore the hearing into civil rights courses, drawing parallels between the labor of sweeping streets and the labor of building democracy. At the University of Memphis, students visited the Lorraine Motel and reflected on the echo between King's death and Jasmine's words. "History is not past," one professor told her class, pointing at the screen, "it is being lived in front of you." Students tweeted the line, and within hours, it was trending, folded into the digital chorus that had already made Jasmine's confrontation immortal. The generational elderly Americans saw their memories honored. Young Americans saw their lessons come alive. Families gathered around screens, grandparents retelling stories of 1968, children listening with wide eyes. The past too often reduced to black and white photos in a textbook now pulsed in full color on live television. Jasmine had carried it into the present, refusing to let it fade. But beyond history and classrooms, a larger message crystallized. Commentators repeated it until it rang across airwaves. No job is beneath dignity. It is the silent work, the invisible work that holds society together. The sanitation worker, the janitor, the nurse aide, the bus driver, the laborers whose sweat built the roads, cleared the rubble, kept the lights on without them. Nothing else functioned. Jasmine had ripped the veil off contempt, and America was forced to stare at the truth. Union leaders see there is no justice without dignity. At rallies, workers repeated Jasmine's lines, sometimes word for word, as if they were scripture. "He doesn't need a statue," became a chant, bouncing off City Hall steps, shouted in picket lines, taped onto protest signs. The movement for higher wages and stronger protections found in Jasmine's moment, a symbol far more powerful than any contract dispute. It was not just negotiation, it was moral ground. And as the days passed, the story did not fade. It spread further, morphing from clip to icon. Posters appeared at rallies. Jasmine holding the resolution. Melania slumped in silence, the caption reading, "Dignity versus Disdain." Murals went up in Philadelphia and Chicago, showing sanitation workers of 1968 side by side with Jasmine in 2025. The link was deliberate, a line unbroken across 57 years, a reminder that battles for dignity are never over. In op-ed pages, writers framed it as a turning point. This was not just a takedown of Melania Trump, wrote one columnist. This was a resurrection of an unfinished fight. Another declared, Jasmine Crockett has done what few politicians dare. She reminded America that its backbone is not its billionaires, but its workers. These words spread as quickly as the clip itself, repeated in sermons, in classrooms, and union halls. In churches, pastors invoked it on Sunday mornings. "She said, he doesn't need a statue," thundered one preacher in Birmingham. "Because he laid the foundation of justice itself." That scripture and action, my brothers and sisters, congregations rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, affirming. The moral weight of labor was no longer theory. It was faith reborn. And in workplaces, the effect was tangible. Sanitation crews across the country reported feeling seen for the first time in years. One worker in Los Angeles told a local paper, "I've been doing this 25 years. People walked past me every day like I'm invisible. But after Jasmine, my daughter, hugged me when I came home and said, 'Daddy, you're a hero.'" The line spread across social media, paired with photos of fathers in uniforms, mothers in gloves, workers standing tall in orange vests, students, workers, pastors, politicians. The reaction converged into a tidal wave. And at its center was a message no one could ignore. Society stands on the shoulders of those who labor in silence. It was not rhetoric. It was survival. Jasmine had ripped that truth from the shadows and held it up in Congress for all to see. The narrative gained momentum until it became something larger, a new symbol of the modern labor movement. Strikes, protests, and negotiations in the months ahead invoked her words. Hashtags bloomed, chart dignity of labor, keepers of the pulse. The image of sanitation workers holding "I am a man" signs resurfaced on placards at Starbucks union rallies. Amazon warehouse protests. Teachers' marches. For the first time in years, the labor struggle felt connected across industries, across generations, stitched together by one viral moment in Congress. Sociologists wrote essays calling it a cultural reset. Journalists framed it as the rebirth of labor dignity in the American imagination. Even politicians began to tread carefully. To dismiss workers after Jasmine's moment risked backlash, to respect them earned applause. The moral equation had shifted not through policy but through the raw force of narrative. And so the story kept climbing, kept burning, kept echoing. It was no longer only Jasmine's father whose name had been written into history. It was every worker who had ever been ignored. The confrontation was not just an event. It was a movement reborn alive in classrooms and marches and sermons, in the sweat of laborers who finally felt the weight of dignity on their shoulders. The chamber scene had ended, but its shock waves continued to rattle America. What began as insult had become legacy. And in that legacy, the spirit of civil rights was not just remembered. It was living, breathing, and marching once again. The roar from the streets did not fade. It hardened into purpose. Congress moved like a hive under a sudden alarm, lights burning late on both sides of the Capitol as phones rang without stopping. Staffers hauled binders, whispered into headsets, and scrolled notes on whiteboards that filled with arrows and underlines. In offices that usually do ceremony, PE whips counted committee chairs, called emergency briefings, and legal counsel pulled precedents from shelves that hadn't been touched in years. The day after the hearing, a name appeared on a draft cover sheet like a banner in a storm: the City Backbone Act. The first draft was simple on purpose, a skeleton built to gather muscle. It declared sanitation workers critical infrastructure labor, triggering federal standards usually reserved for power grids and hospitals. It mandated hazard pay during declared emergencies, guaranteed minimum staffing on night shifts, and required cities to stock protective gear against heat, chemicals, and disease. It ordered paid sick leave that could not be bartered away and whistleblower shields that could not be pierced. It created a grant program to help cities meet the standards without gutting other services. And it told OSHA to write new rules fast. The goal was plain dignity on paper, safety in the field. Committee rooms turned into war rooms. In the House, Education and Labor scheduled a markup as if they were preparing for a storm surge. In the Senate, Help staffers built side-by-side drafts and dared one another to cut the delay. Witness lists formed overnight: sanitation crews, city managers, epidemiologists, and a retired historian who had written about Memphis 1968. Jasmine Crockett sat with her team and carved talking points into a calm, hard edge. She never led with sentiment. She led with duty and cost, reminding members that clean streets prevent disease, protect commerce, and keep schools open. Behind her flat screens looped her father's name beneath the Dallas seal like a heartbeat you could see. Provisions multiplied as testimony poured in. Heat protections became a full section, water stations, cool-down breaks, and emergency shelters when the index spiked. Sharps boxes, puncture-resistant gloves, and rapid post-exposure care were written in like non-negotiables. Funding language prevented privatizers from eating the grants with fees, and a transparency clause forced cities to publish compliance dashboards. A crisis pay escalator kicked in automatically during pandemics and floods, freeing workers from pleading for bonuses when the danger was already obvious. A small but mighty line tucked near the end required cities to include sanitation workers in emergency tabletop exercises at the same table as police, fire, and public health. If they carry the city's pulse, Jasmine told the room, then they deserve a seat where the pulse is taken. Pushback came fast and polished. Budget hawks warned of unfunded mandates and blank checks, while a lobby hired to protect outsourcing whispered about flexibility. A think tank memo arrived with charts that looked authoritative until staffers realized the axes were quietly tilted. Jasmine answered in two languages, numbers and memory. She carried CDC estimates on disease spikes after trash backlogs, and she carried the human cost in words that did not waver. The bill keeps hospitals from filling with infections we can prevent. It keeps kids in school after floods. It pays for itself by not paying later. At markup, her calm landed like a hammer. Hostile amendments wilted under the cameras. The City Backbone Act cleared committee with a bipartisan handful no one predicted. Outside, the country pressed its palms to the glass. The switchboards melted with calls from sanitation yards. Teachers, nurses, pastors, and small business owners who had learned the hard way what closed streets cost. Co-sponsors stacked up like sandbags on a levee. "Put me on it," a representative from a coastal district said after watching a montage of flooded alleys and ruined food lines. Our people in whip meetings, the tally crawled upward until someone whispered, "We've got the votes if the floor holds." The speaker stared down the calendar, then pulled a pen and circled a date. Run it. Floor debate played like a scene carved for history class. Members stood one by one and told the same story in different zip codes. Trash piling high after storms. Workers going out at 3 a.m. Disease curves bending because someone in a fluorescent vest kept the city breathing. A veteran from Baltimore read MLK's line, "All labor has dignity," and then yielded to Jasmine, who spoke like a blade, "Dignity is not a speech, it is a standard. Today, we write it into law." When the board lit up, green swallowed red, and the chamber erupted. Reporters sprinted for cameras, and House security grinned like they'd seen a small miracle. The bill moved across the Capitol like a drum beat you could follow with your feet. The Senate was rough. A filibuster threat blew in from the far aisle. Tall talk about costs and creeping federal fingers. Jasmine and a pair of veterans from both parties stitched a late-night deal at a table covered in coffee rings. A 5-year sunset with a mandatory review targeted grants for small towns and an inspector general to keep the money honest. A senator whose district had lost 2 sanitation workers to heat stroke closed the loop. He stood on the floor with a photo and said, "We can argue math, but we cannot argue their graves." Clower broke at 62. Passage followed at 65 and the marble breathed out. America had just raised the floor under the people who keep its floors clean. Beyond the dome, the world took notice and wrote it down. The BBC led with a stark banner. The moment MLK returned to the U.S. Congress, Al Jazeera aired a long segment on the dignity of work, splicing Jasmine's speech with footage from Memphis. Lemon ran a column titled "From the Broom to the Law," tracing a line from street corners to statutes. NHK played the clip of the vote tally turning green and then cut to Tokyo sanitation crews nodding along at a break table. In Johannesburg, a radio host told her listeners, "They finally said out loud what every city knows: without the people who clean, nothing works." The phrase crossed languages, but not meaning the moment MLK returned to the U.S. Congress. Editorial boards abroad turned analysis into praise and challenge. "America has remembered that public health begins on the curb," wrote The Guardian. "If Congress can do this for those who sweep its streets, ask El Pius, who will do it for those who pick its crops." The coverage carried less sneer than usual and more curiosity, as if a familiar giant had surprised them by bowing to those who carry it. In expat bars and embassy corridors, the clip of the House vote played on loop. Diplomats traded the sentence like a proverb. The moment MLK returned to the U.S. Congress. Airports and train stations played the footage on silent subtitles shouting what the volume did not. The moment MLK returned to the U.S. Congress. Travelers watched without sound and still understood. In group texts that usually swap memes, people shared the graphic of the bill's core promises: hazard pay, PPE, heat shields, sick leave, whistleblower protections. The simple list looked like a floor plan for a safer nation. For a rare span of days, the planet's attention did not revolve around a scandal or a war, but around a law that said out loud what work is worth. Back in Washington, a different kind of stage was being set. Curators at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History sent emails with quiet urgency requests for consultation. Congressional hearing material. They were building an exhibit to bridge 1968 to 2025, and they wanted to get it right down to the shade of the chamber's lights. They asked for a certified copy of Resolution Number 214, a photo of the screen the day it glowed, and if possible, the actual microphone Jasmine used. A conservator with careful hands examined the Dallas seal under a loupe. A designer mocked up a gallery wall where "I am a man" placards would face Jasmine's line. "He doesn't need a statue because he laid the foundation of justice itself." This was not a display. It was a hinge in a story. The installation took shape like a memory you could walk through. Visitors would enter under a neon date 1968 and hear the rumble of a march, then turn a corner into 2025, where a projection of the vote tally turned green in a slow, unstoppable wash. On one plinth lay a sanitation worker's badge pitted in bright. On another, the gavel design the chair used that day reproduced with permission. At an audio station, a button offered two voices. Martin Luther King Jr. saying, "All labor has dignity," and Jasmine Crockett saying, "History has written his name." Above the exit, a quiet reminder glowed, "City Backbone Act enacted." People would leave through that light. Before the ribbon cutting, the museum held a private preview. In the quiet halves of the gallery, a handful of sanitation workers from D.C. stood in their uniforms, caps in hand, looking at themselves in the story. A man traced a finger near but not on the glass where the resolution sat and whispered, "My father would have believed this is a trick." A curator, careful not to intrude, said softly, "Your father built what we stand on." In a corner, Jasmine read the wall text and blinked hard, then smiled without speaking. The weight of glass and paper felt lighter than the weight of what they carried out every night. Booms, lights, and cameras sailed through the gallery recording the exhibit like it was a living witness. Anchors stood before the "I am a man" wall and delivered their lines from a march in Memphis to a vote in Washington. One line, one fight. They pivoted to the city backbone panel and read the bullet points. Their cadence brisk, but their eyes were once soft. Every segment ended at the same plaque: Smithsonian Collections. Jasmine Crockett Congressional Materials. The caption did not brag. It simply placed the moment where it belonged. Inside the country's memory palace, outside school buses idled while teachers counted heads and checked permission slips against class lists. Inside, kids clustered around the audio station and mashed the buttons in turn. King's voice rolled out like a bell. Jasmine sliced through like a chisel. A girl in a denim jacket whispered, "He doesn't need a statue," and finished the line with a smile she didn't try to hide. In a notebook, a teacher wrote a new prompt. "Write about the job that keeps your neighborhood alive." The museum changed from archive to classroom. The way a heart changes from beating to racing. Meanwhile, lawmakers returned to their routines with something added to their steps. Offices that had never taken meeting requests from sanitation unions found space on the calendar. Cities began to pre-file compliance plans, not out of fear of penalties, but out of pride they had not expected to feel. Procurement officers priced heat tents. HR plugged in sickly formulas. Risk managers built dashboards with green, yellow, and red lights that told the truth in real time. On a bulletin board in a city yard, someone taped a printout of Jasmine's quote next to the schedule for the night shift. It read like policy written in a human hand. The political story, the global echo, the museum glass, each layered the same message until it felt carved into stone. Congress had not only passed a bill, it had chosen a narrative that a city's pulse is kept by those who clean it, that a nation's pride must include the people who keep it standing. International media called it the moment MLK returned to the U.S. Congress. The Smithsonian called it history. Workers called it respect. And everywhere the clip still played, a country saw itself and nodded as if recognizing a face in a mirror it had avoided for too long. The noise of the hearing had become a law, a headline, and a display case. And together they told one story clear as daylight, dignity as infrastructure. The roar of the chamber had not faded, but Jasmine knew the moment demanded something more, something final, something that would echo beyond walls and marble, beyond cameras and headlines. The crowd had cheered. The bill had been written. The world had already begun to shift. But history, she knew, was built not only by documents and laws, but by words that carved themselves into the memory of a nation. She stepped forward again. The lights followed her as if the building itself understood that this was the close, the summation, the line that would decide how this day would be remembered. The chamber grew restless, then hushed as if thousands of lungs had drawn in breath and forgotten how to release it. Jasmine's hand rested flat on the desk before her, her eyes rising slowly until they met the cameras. Her voice came calm at first, low and certain as though she was speaking directly into the heart of America. A great nation is not built by towers of gold, but by the humble hands that keep its streets clean for everyone. The line struck like thunder. No metaphor was needed, no elaboration required. The words painted themselves across every mind in the chamber. Reporters froze in mid-scribble, their pens hanging in the air. Senators stiffened, some shifting uneasily, others leaning forward as though the line itself had pulled them in. In the gallery, a hush fell so complete that the faint hum of the lights above was the only sound. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She repeated the words again. Stronger, louder, sharper this time, turning her body slightly toward the cameras. A great nation is not built by towers of gold, but by the humble hands that keep its streets clean for everyone. Each syllable struck like a gavel, pounding against arrogance, against indifference, against the false pride of those who sneered at labor. The effect was electric. Some senators lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others nodded solemnly as if to record their agreement on their very faces. The gallery stirred hands, clapping slowly at first, then louder until the sound swelled into applause that the gavel could not quiet. Jasmine raised a hand, silencing the chamber again. You measure a nation not by the height of its towers or the wealth of its palaces, she said, voice climbing now, but by how it honors the workers who rise before dawn, who sweep the streets, who keep disease from spreading, who make every other dream possible. That is greatness. That is justice. The camera zoomed closer. Her face filled every television screen in America, every live stream, every phone in every hand. The clarity of her words made them inescapable. People at home sat up straighter. Some whispered them aloud. Some wrote them down. Already captions were racing across Twitter, TikTok, and news tickers. A great nation is not built by towers of gold. Then she turned, locking her gaze once more on Melania. The chamber stilled again because everyone knew this was personal now. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. It sharpened into something final. The edge of a verdict. You mocked my father for sweep. But the truth is this men and women like him built this country in ways gold never could. When towers fall, it is their hands that clear the rubble. When floods rise, it is their hands that keep the streets alive. And when history remembers this nation, it will remember them not the gold, not the arrogance, but the work that held us all together. Melania's eyes fell. She didn't try to answer. Her lips pressed tight, her posture shrank, and the cameras caught every detail. The collapse of composure, the mask of disdain dissolving into silence. She looked suddenly small, almost swallowed by the chair. The image was broadcast everywhere. Jasmine standing tall, light haloed around her. Melania bowed in defeat. The crowd erupted again. This time it wasn't a sudden cheer. It was a standing ovation that grew layer by layer until the entire chamber was on its feet. The sound shook the room louder than any gavel, more relentless than any. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, microphones rattled under the force of applause. Some senators clapped with heads bowed, others with hands raised high. The gallery roared like a stadium, but Jasmine didn't bask. She let the ovation crest, then held up her hand one last time. The chamber, still trembling on the edge of silence. Her voice, steady and resolute, carried the final blow. A nation that forgets its workers is a nation built on sand. But a nation that honors them honors the humble hands that sweep and serve. That is a nation no storm can wash away. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze in stillness as if struck by awe. And then once more the applause crashed down, unstoppable. Uncontainable. The words had become something larger than rhetoric. They were prophecy carved into the air, carried on every broadcast, destined to live long after the marble hall had emptied. On television screens across the country, the moment became news anchors repeated the line emphasizing each word as though engraving it. Families watching at home clapped in their living rooms. Elderly men and women wept openly, whispering that they had heard these truths before in marches long past. But never thought they would be spoken again in the halls of Congress. Sanitation workers filmed themselves cheering, chanting Jasmine's line in their own accents, their own voices until it spread across every platform. The image was unforgettable. Jasmine Crockett standing tall framed by light, her words echoing in the chamber while Melania Trump shrank into shadow. It was cinematic. A freeze frame destined for history books. The message was undeniable. A great nation does not stand on towers of gold. It stands on the humble, unseen, uncelebrated labor that keeps it alive. The moment was not just a close to a hearing. It was the kind of ending that doesn't end at all. It reverberates. It grows. It becomes part of the marrow of a country. And in that thunderous applause, in that cinematic image, in that final line etched into history, America remembered itself. The chamber was still roaring with applause when Jasmine raised her hand once more, not to silence, but to summon. The camera zoomed tight, capturing her eyes blazing with urgency. Her voice cut through the thunder like a blade through air. This fight is not mine alone. It belongs to every worker who has ever been ignored. Every family who has ever been told their labor is worthless. The words rolled across the chamber, pulling every ear into their gravity. She leaned into the microphone. Her tone fierce and unrelenting. Do not leave this room thinking history ends here. Carry it forward. Stand up in your towns, your schools, your workplaces. Demand respect for those who keep the heartbeat of this country alive. The urgency in her voice was a drum beat pounding into the hearts of the audience and the millions watching at home. The chamber leaned in breathless as Jasmine struck the final call. Rise with me. Rise for dignity. Rise for justice. And rise for the workers who hold this nation together, unseen, but unstoppable. The words landed like fire, and the nation knew the battle was no longer just hers. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a